Moscow, 1940. A photograph was changed. It was a photograph that had been taken in 1920 on the steps of a platform in Sverdlovsk Square in Moscow, showing Lenin addressing a crowd of soldiers being sent to the Polish front. The photograph was famous. It had been reproduced in newspapers and books and exhibition catalogues across the Soviet Union and beyond. It showed Lenin at the microphone, arm extended, the crowd below him, and on the steps to the right of the platform, visible and prominent, two men, Leon Trotsky and Lev Kamenev. In the altered version, Trotsky and Kamenev were gone. The steps were empty. Lenin stood at the microphone with the arm extended and the crowd below, and nothing to his right but air and the wooden boards of the platform where the two men had been. This was not a sophisticated operation. It was done with the instruments available, retouching, airbrushing, the physical alteration of the photographic print before reproduction. And if you look at the altered photograph knowing what to look for, the absence is visible as absence, the space where the men stood slightly too clean. The composition slightly wrong in the way that a composition is slightly wrong when something has been removed from it that the original composition included. But you had to know what to look for. If you had not seen the original, if you had grown up with the altered version as the version, if the original had been removed from the libraries and the archives and the collections where it had previously been accessible, if the erasure had been sufficiently thorough that the original was no longer the version you could compare the alteration against, then the empty steps were just empty steps, and the man who had stood on them had not stood on them, and the revolution had happened without him. This is the story of the most systematic attempt in modern history to remove a person from the record of their own participation in the events that defined the century, to erase not just a man's future but his past, not just his political position, but his historical existence, not just his name from the institutions he had built, but his face from the photographs of the moments he had inhabited. It almost worked. It did not fully work, and the reasons it did not fully work are as important as the reasons it came as close as it did, and both are the subject of this account. The man who was being erased was Leon Trotsky. The man doing the erasing was Joseph Stalin. The instrument was the Soviet state, and everything the Soviet state controlled: the archives, the libraries, the schools, the encyclopedias, the newspapers, the publishing houses, the photographic collections, the film archives, the historical institutes, the memory of a country of nearly 200 million people. It was the largest editorial operation in human history. To understand the erasure, you have to understand what was being erased, not just who Trotsky was, his biography, his role, his significance, but what his existence in the historical record represented to Stalin, and why the representation was intolerable in a way that required the specific response of attempting to make him cease to have existed. Trotsky had been alongside Lenin, the architect of the October Revolution, not in the secondary sense that historical accounts sometimes use, the devoted lieutenant, the implementer of the visionary's plan, but in the primary, operational sense that the revolution required. The Military Revolutionary Committee that organized the insurrection was chaired by Trotsky. The seizure of the key positions in Petrograd was coordinated by Trotsky. Lenin provided the theoretical authority and the political direction. Trotsky provided the organizational genius and the voice. He had then built the Red Army from nothing, from the ruins of the Tsarist military, and from peasant conscripts, and from the specific challenge of creating a fighting force in a country simultaneously fighting foreign intervention and domestic counter-revolution, and had commanded it through the civil war that determined whether the revolution would survive its own infancy. He had ridden the armored train across the fronts, appearing at critical moments, delivering speeches that transformed the men he was speaking to, exercising the specific quality of immediate authority that armies running on revolutionary consciousness rather than professional training require and rarely find. He had won the Civil War. The Red Army he built had won it. And Lenin, in his testament, the document he dictated in the months before his death, the document that assessed the senior figures of the party and offered recommendations about the succession, had described Trotsky as the most capable man in the Central Committee. This was the man Stalin needed to erase, not because Trotsky was a rival in the immediate political sense by 1928 or 1929 or 1930, when the erasure was already well advanced. Trotsky had been expelled from the Soviet Union in 1929. He was in exile in Turkey, then France, then Norway, then Mexico, writing his books and his articles and his political analysis and his denunciations of Stalinism from the specific distance of a man who was outside the country he was being erased from. He could not challenge Stalin's power directly. He could not organize a coup. He could not even from Turkey or France or Mexico fully reach the Soviet population he was being erased from, because the Soviet state controlled what reached the Soviet population. The need for the erasure was not primarily about Trotsky as a living political threat, though the living threat was real enough. His arguments circulating outside the Soviet Union constituted a challenge to the legitimacy of the Stalinist state that Stalin addressed with multiple instruments, including the eventual physical elimination at Coyoacán in 1940. The need for the erasure was about something more structural and more permanent. The need to control the meaning of the revolution itself. If Trotsky had been what he had been, if the October Revolution had been what the historical record showed it to be, with Trotsky as its co-architect and the Red Army victory as his specific achievement, then Stalin's claim to the revolutionary inheritance was complicated. Not impossible, not eliminated, but complicated in ways that the Stalinist political mythology could not accommodate. The mythology required a clean line of descent from Lenin to Stalin, a direct transmission of revolutionary legitimacy that bypassed the complicated reality of the succession struggle and the complicated reality of what Trotsky had contributed and the complicated reality of what Lenin had actually said about both men in the document he had written, precisely because he was worried about the succession and what it might produce. The testament had said, Stalin is too rude and should be removed from the position of General Secretary. The testament had said, Trotsky is the most capable man in the Central Committee. Both of these statements were in the document. Both of them needed to not be in the document if the mythology was going to work, and so both of them were suppressed. The testament was not published in the Soviet Union under Stalin, and the erasure of Trotsky from the historical record was the physical, visual, institutional complement to the suppression of the text. The erasure began before Trotsky was expelled. It began in the middle 1920s, during the succession struggle, as the factional conflict that followed Lenin's incapacitation and then his death in January 1924 produced winners and losers in the specific way that factional conflicts in institutions with no mechanism for legitimate succession always produce them, through the accumulation of institutional power by one faction at the expense of others, through the control of the agenda of meetings, through the management of appointments and promotions, and the specific distribution of party resources that determined which positions were worth holding and which were not. Stalin won the succession struggle. He won it because he was better at the game being played, the organizational game, the management of the party apparatus, the patient accumulation of loyalty through the distribution of positions to men who owed their positions to him, than Trotsky, who was better at the other games, but not that one. By 1927, Trotsky's position in the party had been reduced to nothing. By 1929, he was expelled from the country, and the erasure, which had been proceeding gradually through the succession years, accelerated. The first instrument of the erasure was the encyclopedia. The Great Soviet Encyclopedia was the authoritative reference work of the Soviet state, the comprehensive multi-volume account of knowledge as the Soviet state organized and approved it, the document to which citizens and institutions turned when they needed the official version of what something was or who someone had been. It was published in editions across the Stalin years, and each edition was the opportunity to revise the entries that the changing political situation required to be revised. Trotsky's entry in early editions had described him accurately, his role in the revolution, his command of the Red Army, his political positions, his relationship with Lenin. As the succession struggle proceeded and his political position deteriorated, the entries were revised. The revisions were not immediate and comprehensive. They were gradual, following the political situation, each revision removing a little more, or softening a little more, or recontextualizing a little more, until the entries in the Stalin period editions described not the man who had chaired the Military Revolutionary Committee and built the Red Army, but a traitor and saboteur whose historical role had been to oppose Lenin at critical moments and to serve, wittingly or unwittingly, the interests of foreign powers hostile to the Soviet state. The encyclopedia entry was the official version. The libraries that held the encyclopedia held the official version. The teachers who taught from the encyclopedia taught the official version. The students who learned from the teachers learned the official version. And the official version, repeated in enough places for long enough, by enough authoritative sources, became for a significant portion of the Soviet population the version, the thing they knew, rather than the thing they had been taught, because the distinction between knowing and being taught dissolves when what you have been taught is the only version available. The libraries were the second instrument. The Soviet library system, the network of public, institutional, and specialized libraries that served the Soviet Union's educational and research needs, held in 1924 and 1925 and 1926 copies of Trotsky's books, his collected works, his speeches, his articles, the literature he had produced across a career that stretched from the early 1900s to the present. These were not marginal or obscure publications. They were the works of a man who had been, for a period, the second figure in the Soviet state, and they had been published and distributed and held in collections across the country in the way that the works of senior Soviet figures were published and distributed. The instructions went to the libraries: remove the works. The specific mechanism varied. Sometimes the books were physically collected and destroyed. Sometimes they were reclassified into restricted sections accessible only to specifically authorized researchers. Sometimes they were simply removed from the catalog so that they could not be found by someone who did not know to look for them by their specific shelf location. The effect was the same. A citizen who went to a library to find Trotsky's work could not find it, and a citizen who could not find it could not read it, and a citizen who could not read it could not form an independent assessment of the man the encyclopedia was characterizing as a traitor. The books that remained were the books that described Trotsky as the official version required him to be described. The books written by Trotsky describing himself were gone. The photographs were the third instrument, the Soviet Photographic Archive. The collections held by the official press agencies, by the party archives, by the military records, by the historical institutes, contained thousands of images of Trotsky, images from the revolution, images from the Civil War years when he had traveled the fronts on the armored train and been photographed with troops and commanders, and the specific documentation that military campaigns of the period generated, images from the party congresses and the public ceremonies, and the occasions that had been photographically documented because they were the occasions of the Soviet state, and the Soviet state documented its occasions. The instructions went to the archive managers: remove, alter, reclassify. The specific responses varied with the specific archive and the specific manager and the specific image. Some images were physically destroyed, some were altered. The airbrushing and retouching that the Sverdlov square photograph underwent, removing figures from group images and replacing them with empty space or background. Some were reclassified into restricted sections that functioned practically as removal. The work was not always technically sophisticated. The Soviet retouching of photographs has been studied by historians who have had access to both the original images and the altered versions, and the alterations are often detectable, the composition slightly wrong, the background inconsistent in the space where the figure was, the specific quality of an image from which something has been removed that the composition did not account for removing, but the detection requires comparison. You cannot detect the alteration if you do not have the original. And the original was, by design, unavailable. The archive that held the original had been instructed to hold it in the section that was not accessible. The print in the library had been removed. The reproduction in the publication had been replaced with the altered version. The original and the altered version were not both available to the citizen who went looking, because the citizen who went looking would only find what the system had decided should be found. The Sverdlov Square photograph is the most famous case because it has been most thoroughly documented, because copies of the original survived outside the Soviet Union, and the comparison between the original and the altered version became, in the decades after Stalin's death, one of the most reproduced demonstrations of what the erasure had done and how it had done it. But the Sverdlov Square photograph was not an exceptional case. It was a typical one. There were hundreds of photographs altered in the same way, and the systematic nature of the alteration, the fact that it was not a few isolated instances but an institutional program conducted across the full photographic archive, is the specific thing that distinguishes what Stalin did to the historical record from the ordinary revisionism that all political systems practice. The film archive was the fourth instrument. Soviet cinema of the revolutionary and early Soviet period had documented or had fictionally reconstructed the events of 1917 and the Civil War years in ways that included Trotsky as a significant figure, as a presence, a voice, a face associated with specific events and specific historical moments. These films were in the archive. Some of them had been distributed and seen by audiences across the Soviet Union. All of them were available in principle to the archivists and the researchers and the film historians who worked with the Soviet film collection. The instructions went to the film archive: restrict access, reclassify, in some cases destroy, the films that showed Trotsky in ways inconsistent with the official version, that showed him as a hero of the revolution, as the commander of the Red Army, as a figure of significance and authority, were removed from circulation. The films that remained in circulation were the films that were consistent with the official version, which increasingly meant the films that had been made during the Stalin period that showed the Stalinist version of history, with Stalin at its center and Trotsky either absent or present only as the traitor the official version required. Sergei Eisenstein's films, October, The Battleship Potemkin. The early Soviet cinema that had achieved international recognition as artistic achievements independent of their political content were present in the archive and in some cases in international distribution, and their treatment of Trotsky created specific problems that were addressed in specific ways. Scenes were cut. Instructions were given to foreign distributors about how the films should be presented. The specific management of what the films contained and what they showed was a continuous process that followed the political situation across the Stalin years, each revision producing a version slightly more consistent with the current official version of what the revolution had been. The school curriculum was the fifth instrument. Soviet children learned history in Soviet schools, and Soviet schools taught history from Soviet textbooks, and Soviet textbooks were produced by the state apparatus that controlled their content. The history of the revolution and the Civil War and the early Soviet period that Soviet children learned in the Stalin years was not the history of those events as they had occurred, but the history of those events as the official version required them to be presented. A history in which Stalin had been present at the decisive moments, in which his role had been central, in which his relationship with Lenin had been close, and his understanding of Lenin's vision had been most accurate, and in which Trotsky had been present only at the margins and as the antagonist. The specific claims of the Stalinist historical curriculum, that Stalin had been at Lenin's side throughout the revolutionary period, that Stalin's military judgment had been decisive at critical moments of the Civil War, that Trotsky's contributions had been either minimal or harmful, were not accurate by the standard of the documentary evidence. But the documentary evidence was in the archives that had been restricted, and the restricted archives were not available to the school children learning the curriculum, and the school children learning the curriculum were the Soviet citizens of the next generation, and the Soviet citizens of the next generation would carry what they had been taught as what they knew. The erasure was generational in its design as well as its execution. It was not just removing Trotsky from the present. It was ensuring that the generation that came after would not find Trotsky in the past, would find instead the empty steps and the missing face and the absence that the system had worked to make invisible as absence. The show trials were the sixth instrument. The Moscow show trials of 1936, 1937, and 1938. The three trials in which the surviving members of the old Bolshevik generation, The men who had made the revolution and who were now charged with having betrayed it were brought before a court and confessed to crimes they had not committed, served multiple functions in the Stalinist political program. They eliminated physical threats. They demonstrated the consequences of opposition. They mobilized mass political attention and generated the specific quality of public outrage that the regime could direct and use. They also, in their specific content, served the erasure. The confessions named Trotsky. The confessions described Trotsky as the organizing principle of the conspiracy, the man in exile who had directed the sabotage, who had maintained contact with the defendants through illegal channels, who had received orders from foreign powers and transmitted them to his agents inside the Soviet Union. The defendants described meetings with Trotsky in cities they had not visited, on dates they had not been there, described receiving instructions from him through emissaries who were named and who were either dead or also on trial and also confessing to the same instructions, described participating in operations that had been designed by Trotsky from his exile in Turkey or France or Norway. The confessions were false. This was demonstrated comprehensively by the Dewey Commission in 1937 and has been confirmed by every serious historical investigation since. The confessions were extracted by the Lubyanka's specific combination of sleep deprivation and psychological pressure and explicit threat, and the specific mechanism by which a man who has been in the hands of the Soviet security apparatus long enough can be brought to say what the apparatus needs him to say. But the confessions were public. They were printed in the newspapers. They were broadcast on the radio. They were read in the factories and the schools and the party meetings, where the reading of the trial transcripts was organized by the party apparatus, and they added to the archive of what Trotsky was officially understood to be a layer of specific, detailed, confessed criminality that the encyclopedia entries and the altered photographs and the restricted library holdings had been building toward. He was not just absent from the historical record, he was present in it as the villain. The erasure had two components: the removal of the legitimate presence and the installation of the illegitimate one. Where Trotsky had been the co-architect of the revolution, that had been removed. Where Trotsky had been the traitor directing the conspiracy, that had been installed. The space in the record that the legitimate presence had occupied was filled with its opposite, so that the citizen who encountered Trotsky's name in the Soviet record encountered it in the context of the show trial confessions and the encyclopedia's account of his treachery. This was more thorough than simple erasure. Simple erasure leaves a gap. What Stalin did filled the gap with its opposite, so that the gap itself was no longer visible as a gap, almost. The reasons the erasure almost worked are the reasons it did work for a time for a significant portion of the population: the completeness of the system's control over the information environment that Soviet citizens inhabited, and the specific effectiveness of the generational mechanism, the replacement of a generation that had known the original with a generation that knew only the revision. The reasons it did not fully work are more complicated and more instructive. The first reason is geography. Trotsky was not inside the Soviet Union when the erasure was being conducted. He was in Turkey and France and Norway and Mexico, writing the books he was writing: The History of the Russian Revolution, The Revolution Betrayed, his biography of Stalin, his autobiography, were being published outside the Soviet Union in languages accessible to readers outside the Soviet Union, and those readers were not subject to the Soviet system's control of the information environment. The History of the Russian Revolution alone, the 3-volume account of 1917 that Trotsky wrote in Turkish exile in 1930-31, from memory and from documents he had brought with him, that was published in English and German and French and other languages, and that was assessed by historians of the period as one of the most significant accounts of the events it described, was on shelves in libraries in New York and London and Paris, in editions that the Soviet system could not reach and could not alter and could not classify as restricted. The account it contained was not the official version. It was the account of a man who had been present, who remembered what he had been present for, who described it with the specific precision of a participant who is also a historian. The men and women who read it in New York and London and Paris in the 1930s and 1940s had access to a version of the October Revolution that the Soviet citizens of the same period did not have access to, and the version they had access to was not the version that Stalin was constructing. The second reason is the archive. The Soviet archive was extensive, but it was not the only archive in the world that held relevant materials. The documents of the revolutionary period, the correspondence, the decrees, the meeting records, the party documents, the military records existed in multiple copies in multiple locations, and not all of those locations were inside the Soviet Union and therefore subject to the Soviet system's management. The German archives, the French archives, the British archives, the archives of the various émigré organizations that had documented Soviet affairs from the outside. These held materials that the Soviet system could not reach and that preserved the record of what had actually happened in ways that survived the Soviet revision. The third reason is the people. The erasure was conducted on the documentary record, but the documentary record is not the only form in which the past is preserved. The people who had been present, who had known Trotsky, who had served under him, who had worked with him, who had fought alongside him, were not all dead, and not all of them were inside the Soviet Union, and not all of those inside the Soviet Union were fully converted by the official version. Some of them remembered, some of them maintained, in private, in silence, in the specific form of knowledge that a person carries when they know something and are not permitted to say it. The information that the archive had been instructed to suppress, the memoirs that were written after Stalin's death by surviving party members, by military officers, by the children of the old Bolsheviks who had been executed or imprisoned, by the people who had been adjacent to the events and who wrote when writing became less dangerous, contain the testimony of people who carried the private version across the decades of the official version and produced it when the official version's control loosened sufficiently to permit it. Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956, the 4-hour address to the 20th Party Congress that documented Stalin's crimes and that represents the most significant single official acknowledgement of what the Stalinist period had been, did not rehabilitate Trotsky. It explicitly did not rehabilitate Trotsky. Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin's crimes did not extend to the acknowledgement that the man Stalin had most systematically destroyed had been correctly destroyed, because the political system that was making the denunciation was still the political system that had been founded on the claims that Trotsky had been wrong and that the official version had been right. The rehabilitation of Trotsky would have been the rehabilitation of the critique of the Soviet system itself, which was not something the 1956 Communist Party of the Soviet Union was prepared to undertake. But the speech confirmed the framework of the argument that Trotsky had been making from exile. It confirmed that the show trials had been falsified. It confirmed that the confessions had been extracted under coercion. It confirmed that Stalin had committed crimes of the kind and the scale that the official version had denied, and that Trotsky had been arguing, from Turkey and France and Norway and Mexico, that Stalin was committing. It confirmed the accuracy of the exile's diagnosis without rehabilitating the exile. The diagnosis was confirmed from inside the Soviet system by a Soviet leader at a Soviet Party Congress. The man who had made the diagnosis from exile, in books published in New York and London and Paris, had been dead for 16 years. He had been killed by an ice axe in Mexico City in 1940, in his study, by a man trained in Moscow. He did not live to hear the confirmation. His books had been on the shelves in the libraries outside the Soviet Union the entire time. The final phase of the almost is the decades since Stalin's death, in which the historical recovery of Trotsky's actual role has proceeded slowly, imperfectly, incompletely, but persistently, through the opening of the Soviet archives and the access that historians gained to the documentary record that the Soviet system had controlled and that the system's dissolution made accessible in ways that the system's continuation had not permitted. The Soviet archives opened partially in the late 1980s and more fully in the early 1990s, following the collapse of the Soviet Union. What they contained What the historians who gained access to them found in the files that had been classified and restricted across the decades of Soviet rule was the record that the official version had been constructed to contradict. The party documents showed what Trotsky's role in 1917 had actually been. The military records showed what his command of the Red Army had actually involved. The correspondence showed what Lenin had actually said and what the relationship between the two men had actually been. The internal security files showed how the confessions in the show trials had been extracted and what the actual relationship between the confession and the truth was. The archive confirmed what the books published in New York and London and Paris had been saying for decades. The erasure had been built on the suppression of the archive. The recovery was built on the archive's accessibility. What Stalin had controlled, the physical, institutional infrastructure of the Soviet information environment, could be controlled only as long as the system that controlled it continued to function. When the system stopped functioning, the infrastructure it had been used to control became available, and the available infrastructure contained the record that the official version had been constructed to replace. The photographs are the most striking example of the recovery because they are the most visible. The original Sverdlov Square photograph and the altered version are both now widely available, reproduced in histories of the period, displayed in exhibitions about Soviet censorship and propaganda, used in the specific way that before and after images are used when the before and after comparison is itself the argument. The man who was removed from the steps is back on the steps. The alteration is visible because the original is visible. The absence is recognizable as absence because the original presence has been restored. The restoration is partial and ongoing. The Soviet encyclopedias with the revised entries exist alongside the original sources that contradict them. The altered photographs exist alongside the originals. The school textbooks that taught the official version exist alongside the historical scholarship that has documented what the official version replaced. The record of the erasure and the record of the thing erased are both now in the historical record, which is the specific condition that the erasure was designed to prevent. It was designed to prevent the comparison. The comparison is now available. What does the almost of the title mean? It means that the erasure succeeded for decades inside the Soviet Union, that the generations who grew up with the official version knew the official version as the version, and that the official version's control over the information environment was sufficiently complete that the private knowledge of the people who remembered was not available to the people who did not, and the people who did not were the majority, and the majority's understanding of the revolution and the Civil War and the early Soviet period was the understanding that the official version had constructed. It means that the erasure did not succeed outside the Soviet Union, that the books Trotsky wrote from exile, and the archives that existed outside Soviet control, and the testimony of people who remembered, and the scholarly work of the historians who studied the period from outside the system meant that the world outside the Soviet Union never fully accepted the official version, and the scholarship produced outside the system was available to the system survivors when the system ended. It means that the erasure ultimately failed in the most fundamental sense, because the thing that Stalin was most urgently trying to erase, the argument that the Soviet state was not what it claimed to be, that the revolution had been betrayed, that the system was a bureaucratic tyranny using the language of liberation to administer its own interests, was the argument that history confirmed. Not because Trotsky was right about everything and not because the alternative he proposed was adequate to the situation he diagnosed, but because the diagnosis was accurate and the accuracy was documented and the documentation survived. Stalin erased Trotsky from the photographs. He erased him from the encyclopedias and the libraries and the school curricula and the film archive. He erased him from the memories of the people who could be made to forget, and from the lives of the people who could be made to stop living. He sent the ice axe to Mexico City. He extracted the confessions in the Lubyanka. He suppressed the testament. He did not erase the books from the shelves in New York and London and Paris. He did not erase the archives that existed outside his system's reach. He did not erase the argument from the record of what the argument had predicted and what had come true. The photographs are both available now, the original and the altered version, the steps with Trotsky on them and the steps without him. You can place them side by side and see exactly what was done and exactly what was removed and exactly what the empty space represents. The empty space represents the largest editorial operation in human history, conducted by the most powerful state apparatus of the 20th century, organized around the suppression of a single man's participation in the events that produced the century. It almost worked. Almost. The almost is the distance between what a state can control and what a state can erase, and the distance is larger than the Soviet state's architects believed it to be. And the discovery of the distance is the most significant fact that the erasure's failure produced. You cannot erase everything. You can control what is in the archive. You cannot control what is outside it. You can remove the man from the photograph. You cannot remove the original photograph from the world. You can suppress the argument. You cannot suppress its accuracy. The steps are empty in the altered version. Trotsky is on them in the original. Both photographs exist. The record is complete. The erasure failed.